Before I jump in, I'll quickly introduce myself and my organization, Manulife Investment Management. Manulife, our parent company, is a Toronto-headquartered, globally diversified financial services company. And we have a global wealth and asset management platform that provides services to institutional and retail investors, as well as retirement services. Our timberland and agriculture business is the largest portion of our private assets business at Manulife Investment Management. I joined Manulife Investment Management about a year and a half ago to lead impact investing and natural climate solutions across our timber and agriculture businesses. And what that means is really building on our core focus on sustainability, which I'll go into in a second, to develop new products and strategies that lead with impact. Just to focus on our timberland business itself, we are the largest institutional investor in timberland in the world, with approximately 6 million acres under management and about $11.5 billion of assets under management. We've been investing in timberland sustainably for over 35 years, and we build sustainable and globally diversified portfolios on behalf of our clients. In addition, we have a vertically integrated model, which means that we manage not only the investment strategy and process, but we also manage the forest operations on the ground. In forestry alone, we have over 400 employees, 300 plus of which are in the field managing our forests on behalf of our clients on a day-to-day basis. Our integrated approach creates value for clients, improves alignment of interest, and it ensures that our commitment to sustainability carries through from the investment strategy stage all the way through to on-the-ground execution. It's also important to note that we have an industry-leading economic research team and a dedicated sustainability team, both of which are integrated throughout our investment process. I want to touch a little more deeply on our commitment to stewardship and sustainability. So since 1985, our commitment to sustainability and responsible investing, or SRI investing, has been a core guiding principle. We live and breathe our founding ethos that good stewardship is good business. And as I mentioned, our integrated property management ensures that we can pull that ethos of sustainability through from our investment strategy to our management on the ground. 100% of our forests that we manage are sustainably certified to FSC or SFI standards. And as a steward of major timberland holdings around the world, we recognize the importance of sustainable forest management to maintain the long-term health and productivity of our forests, to preserve and enhance the quality of the environment and local communities, to empower our people, and to provide a sustainable and market-driven financial return for our investors. We also have a depth of experience developing a range of ecosystem services that can provide additional social and ecological benefits, as well as driving value. Now to the focus of my presentation. Timber investing has always been grounded in optionality. As timber managers, we can work with our clients to identify the optimal time to harvest based on a range of objectives like profit maximization and factors like forest growth and market conditions. We can also layer on additional ecosystem services like mitigation banking and pollinator habitats on a given property. These value-added services or non-timber income generating strategies can generate additional income and are represented by the red line at the bottom of the slide that cuts across the TimberCarbon optionality spectrum. Carbon accounting and sequestration adds both an established and a newer aspect to the TimberCarbon optionality range. First, the established aspect, greenhouse gas emissions accounting, or Ghg accounting, has developed over the last 20 plus years, and it's shown here by the light blue line at the top of the slide, again, cutting across the TimberCarbon optionality spectrum. I'll touch on how our timberland business accounts for our emissions and our removals through Ghg accounting in a second. The newer dimension to optionality is represented by the middle section of this chart, carbon optionality. We view timber asset management as a spectrum between traditional sustainable timber management on the far left of the screen and more highly intensive carbon-focused management on the far right of the screen. We also know that managing timber assets for timber or carbon is not a purely binary choice. In between the two extremes of traditional sustainable timber-focused management and carbon-focused management lay a range of options that we can apply for our clients and for the environment. And these are anchored in the center by carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality represents a scenario where the emissions that are taken out from timber operations and other impacts are balanced by the sequestration of the forest on average over time. From carbon neutrality moving rightward across the spectrum, we see different levels of carbon versus timber focus intensity. The smaller green portion toward the center of the spectrum represents a scenario where carbon sequestration over time and on average is positive overall from a Ghg accounting perspective. Although we're at a point where a formal registered carbon project that can create creditable revenues may not be feasible or may be subscale. At some point for a given property, we move further to the right to the third gray bubble, which represents the carbon project inflection point. This is where carbon projects reach a scale and are practical to achieve a positive net present value. Here we may see opportunities for carbon projects on properties that are otherwise managed for traditional sustainable timber management. I'll note that at Manulife Investment Management, we have a track record of developing and managing carbon projects in the voluntary and the compliance markets on our client properties that are otherwise managed for traditional sustainable timber management. From that inflection point onward to the right, looking at the orange portion of the spectrum, the intensity of carbon value management compared to traditional sustainable timber management increases. I'll touch on the carbon-focused strategies that Manulife Investment Management is developing a bit later on in the presentation. Let's dive deeper into each of the aspects of the TimberCarbon optionality spectrum. First, let's look at Ghg accounting, which I would consider table stakes or the base level of carbon management for a given forest. The Ghg protocol has been developed over the last 25 years by two organizations, the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, or WBCSD, and the World Resources Institute, WRI. The Ghg protocol is also currently developing land sector emissions and removals guidance, which will extend beyond the established corporate protocols. At Manulife Investment Management, we've been tracking and reporting on our Ghg emissions and removals for over 10 years, and we've been doing so publicly for over 3 years. In addition, we've been working with the Ghg protocol to help develop the draft land sector guidance, and we're a member of the pilot group that's going to test the guidance. Overall, I'm very proud to say that Manulife's timber operations have contributed to the overall corporate reporting net negative carbon emissions over the last 5 years on average. The second core aspect of the timber carbon management spectrum is the timber optionality that I pointed to earlier in my discussion. Manulife Investment Management has a dedicated resource planning and analysis, or RPA team, that works with our foresters on the ground, our client account management team, our economic research team, and others to develop optimization models for timber management. These optimization models have a number of inputs, including inventory and spatial data, economic assumptions, and timber growth and yield projections. Our RPA team then takes those inputs and develops a harvest schedule, that builds on a range of those inputs and constraints. These optimization models can include inputs like inventory and spatial data, economic assumptions, and others. Objectives can range from maximizing timber net present value to ensuring sustainable cuts to carbon sequestration. Constraints can include wood supply agreements, encumbrances, and clear-cut or green-up considerations as examples. I'll note that our RPA team runs these optimization models on every acre for every forest that we manage on an annual basis. We can view carbon as another objective or constraint that we integrate into our optimization models. And carbon objectives can be established at any point along the TimberCarbon value spectrum, from carbon neutral goals all the way to carbon-focused strategies. I'll touch on a few representative carbon and timber management scenarios toward the end of my presentation. Before I dive deeper on carbon optionality, I want to touch a little more closely on value-added services, or those non-timber income-generating strategies. These include a diverse range of activities, many of which were discussed in the first panel, that can be applied to a given timberland. It's from carbon projects to carbon capture and sequestration, recreation leases, mitigation banking, renewable energy siting, pollinator habitats, or mineral agreements where we own the subsurface rights. Manulife Investment Management has a long history of identifying, executing, and managing these value-added services on our managed properties. Since 2016, we've developed over 400 leases with wind developers, apiary managers, maple syrup producers, and others. We've established over 350 recreation access programs. We've participated in 20 different forest carbon and carbon capture and storage projects. And we work with our trusted NGO and state agency partners to identify high biodiversity and high conservation value land and sell easements or properties for long-term protection. As with Ghg Accounting, regardless of where a given timber estate falls on the TimberCarbon optionality spectrum, income-generating opportunities like these can support ecological and social outcomes, generate additional value for investors, and comply with our third-party certification standards for sustainability. So the next few slides go into greater detail for the types of carbon management optionality that we can bring to a given estate. I mentioned that our optimization modeling can maximize outcomes across a range of objectives and constraints, of which carbon can be one. Our RPA team has developed an exciting new capability in its optimization modeling, which is shown in this slide and the subsequent slides. We have the ability to project carbon stocks on a given property or a given investment vehicle with different management regimes. Doing so can allow us to manage a specific timberland investment for discrete carbon outcomes. This first carbon projection provides a hypothetical example of a well-stocked, likely more mature forest that is not specifically managed for carbon outcomes. You can see the blue bars on the left-hand side exhibit relatively high carbon stocking as measured in millions of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Carbon stocking includes above and below ground biomass and standing deadwood, and I'll note here does not fully include the value of carbon sequestration in harvested wood products. The orange line shows a hypothetical timber harvest regime, and the green shows the total volume of standing timber in millions of cubic feet. Over time, the projection displays relatively stable timber harvest and a net depletion of carbon stocks. I want to note that this does not necessarily represent all traditional sustainable timber operations, as each forest will have a different set of characteristics, such as initial timber stocking, species diversification, age class, and of course, management plan. And although timber stocking in this hypothetical case is net negative over time, again, the long-term carbon sequestration potential and biomass associated with this forest is likely higher due to that sequestration capability of harvested wood products assumed to be produced from sustainable timber harvests. Even this net negative management regime may result in that greater carbon sequestration, especially as new uses for timber harvest and harvested wood products like mass timber and cross-laminated timber become more popular. And they displace alternative building materials with higher embodied carbon like concrete and steel. Harvested wood products can lead to decades or longer carbon sequestration. The next scenario falls toward the middle left of the TimberCarbon value optionality spectrum. In this case, we have a timberland that generally exhibits a balance of timber harvest, restocking, and growth over time. Under this management regime, the timberland is managed slightly below carbon neutrality, beginning just above 1.6 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent and ending just below that mark. With this carbon profile, we can intentionally adjust our timber management strategies to attain carbon neutrality by reducing harvest levels. In doing so, and without consideration for any formal carbon project or carbon revenue, we would be sacrificing some amount of financial return in our optimization model. Excuse me. The third hypothetical example here shows positive carbon sequestration over time. Here, the carbon stocking and standing volume end up above initial levels. And this scenario would be representative of the center-right TimberCarbon spectrum that I outlined earlier. Formal carbon projects in this scenario could have three different pathways. One, they could be subscale or not feasible or practical on a given property. Two, they could represent those opportunistic carbon projects that I mentioned that could be nested within a traditional sustainable timber management strategy. Or three, they could be part of a more carbon-focused strategy. This fourth and final scenario is another example of positive carbon sequestration on a hypothetical property over time. Here we assume the establishment of formal registered carbon projects that adhere to a given forest carbon methodology and standards including additionality and permanence, among others. This carbon-focused scenario would lie on the far right of the TimberCarbon value spectrum, and the main driver of value would be carbon value and carbon pricing economics as opposed to traditional timber value. It's important to note that formal carbon projects do not typically completely restrict timber operations and harvest on a given property, and that's represented by the red line across the bottom of the graph, where you see some timber harvest does take place, albeit below growth rates, so that baselines are maintained. The fourth scenario provides the foundation for new carbon-focused strategies that we are developing at Manulife Investment Management. And I'll give a tangible example of this strategy in practice. Last year, we closed on a 90,000-acre transaction in the state of Maine on behalf of our parent company, Manulife, and their general account. And the investment thesis behind that Maine transaction was specifically for carbon-focused value as opposed to traditional sustainable timber value. With that example in Maine and carbon sequestration and crediting as the cornerstone, we are developing the Forest Climate Strategy and the Forest Climate Fund. Here we're combining the various elements of the TimberCarbon optionality spectrum, like, of course, carbon and carbon crediting and value, and layering on other income streams from items like protection through conservation easement sales, non-timber income-generating strategies, and a subsection of traditional sustainable timber management. We think this new approach is a fantastic addition to the menu of timberland investment and management choices that we can provide to our clients. That concludes my presentation, and happy to take any questions from the audience and from online.
Hello, Eric. Jos Lemmens from National Capital Consulting. Could you shed a little bit of light on when you are on the left side of the spectrum, right? More in the harvesting side of the spectrum. With respect to additionality and permanence, right? What do you take into account for the carbon part of the equation, right? Because yeah, you harvest maybe a little bit less, but you keep the optionality in, I assume, because it's more of a harvesting kind of thing. And then suddenly, when prices rise, you start harvesting more, and because that you probably don't decide that right at the start when you plant a tree or whatever. And how do you account then for the subground carbon and the litter, etc.? Because you would have that anyway in a timber environment.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jos. So for the far left of the TimberCarbon optionality spectrum, that's the scenario where we are not considering formal carbon projects, but there still is a wealth of embedded optionality. And as I mentioned earlier in the discussion, the choice to harvest is a fluid one. It is dependent on a number of factors, from market conditions to conditions of the forest itself. And so our RPA team, our operations team, our foresters on the ground are consistently taking that data and making decisions on the optimal time to harvest and maximize value, or maximize the objective of a given strategy regime within the constraints that I mentioned for our clients. We would not be looking at formal carbon crediting in that sense, but we would, of course, be tracking through the GHG protocol our carbon emissions and removals from those operations. It's really when you get toward the center and right of the spectrum that formal carbon projects become an option. And I can repeat the question. So the question shifted to the center of the spectrum. How do you consider permanence and optionality? And I would say, as was mentioned in the previous discussion, the forest carbon markets have been around. They've been evolving for 2+ decades. And in the voluntary market, there are 4 major registries that have set the rules of the game, the protocols and the methodologies. And we're seeing a rapid emergence of standards and principles through organizations like ICVCM on the supply side, VCMI on the demand side. Manulife Investment Management put out our own carbon principles that are aligned with the core carbon principles that are in development by ICVCM in March of this year. And items like additionality and permanence are central to those principles and really underpin the integrity and the quality of credits that we produce, and ultimately that the entire market needs to follow to really allay some of the skepticism that's out there and provide tangible benefits for the environment and for investors. And we would apply that across the entire spectrum where applicable for formal carbon projects.
Thanks, Eric. I've just come from Paul Chatterton is my name. I've just come from a high-level EU discussion on landscape management, and there was a very powerful presentation on the latest forest research for the European Union. It's saying that in the context of climate change, any forest manager should be thinking about a couple of things. One is setting aside any native forests, and you can get carbon management for that. 2, shifting from 1 and 2 species plantations to a minimum 5 species plantations. That is economically viable, and it's the way to maintain your cash flow, because monocultures are becoming quite dangerous. They're falling over. There's also the drought hits them much harder, and so on, and introducing native species. So I just want to see where Manulife is up to on that, on those criteria.
Yep, it's a great question. So I mentioned that we have an integrated sustainability team specifically within our timber and agriculture business. They plug into a global sustainability team at our corporate level, but we also have our timber and ag focused sustainability folks. We also have an SRI toolkit that identifies and reviews various risks, including climate change risk, different weather patterns, natural pests, and other risks at the acquisition phase. So we're doing our due diligence, and that SRI toolkit is deeply embedded into our acquisitions team and our reviews. And I'll give an example. I mean, we know the climate is changing rapidly. We know that that produces additional threats to all species, forests included. And we looked at a California-based forest earlier in the year, and through that SRI toolkit and screening, identified the wildfire risk as too great to make an investment. So we passed on that investment, and that similar screening process really serves us well. Then the other aspect I'll go back to is our integrated, vertically integrated management. So again, the vast majority of my colleagues are foresters on the ground managing our properties. That includes nursery operations, selecting the right species for the right place, and carefully planting and applying silviculture practices. So it is something that we look at, continue to integrate latest studies in science, and ensure that we are building resilient and diversified portfolios for our investors.
I don't hear the answer to my question. How many hectares are you setting aside? What new species are you, what diversification of species are you doing, and where are you shifting to native species?
Yeah. So yes, so we have a sensitive lands program that we've managed. We've set aside, I think the number is 450,000 plus acres over the years. I don't have the exact answer to new species that we're integrating, but I will say that we do manage a mix of managed plantations as well as mixed native species depending on the geography.
All right, thank you, Eric. I really appreciate Manulife's taking into account financially both the carbon side and the traditional sustainable timber supply. But I was kind of missing a little bit this idea about biodiversity, and as far as I could see, the other uses of forest land like wind farms and apiary and so on, you can presumably quantify them based on the return on investment. But how would you think possibly in the future Manulife would incorporate biodiversity into the same optimization scheme that you presented? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I mentioned that all of our forests are sustainably certified to SFI or FSC standards. Previous panel pointed out some of the growth opportunities for those sustainable certifications. We're also active in helping to develop TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures, and we're also developing a nature-positive approach where we are building up our measurement capabilities for items like biodiversity and actively looking into those nascent biodiversity credit markets. We do see a lot of opportunity and a lot of interesting future developments in that space that could, of course, lead to positive biodiversity outcomes and potentially additional income for our clients. So it's very much on our radar, and I'd say it's early days, but a very important part of how we look at managing holistically the properties that our clients own. All right. Thank you very much.